Hello YouTube. Okay, we're continuing our series on consent. I ended the last video by looking at one of Tom Doherty's arguments concerning deception. Recall that Doherty's view is that even run-of-the-mill deceptions, such as lying about your income or about your personality or about your beliefs, even these can undermine consent. So second argument is the argument from the Chihuahua, and this is basically just an analogy. My friend asks me if he can stay over at my house, and he asks if he can bring his dog with him. Knowing that I hate Chihuahuas and would never allow a Chihuahua in my house, he tells me that he has a Great Dane. When I discover his deception, I'm annoyed, but he says, well, you agreed to have a dog in your house, so you consented. Now, obviously that response is completely inadequate. I consented to have a particular kind of dog in my house. I didn't consent to have just any dog whatsoever in my house. So the Chihuahua was brought into my house without my consent. I only initially agreed to it because of my friend's deception. I mean, that seems pretty clearly that that is non-consensual. I did not consent to have a Chihuahua in my house. And Doherty says basically the same thing is going on in the Chloe and Victoria case. Recall that Victoria is a sort of peace-loving hippie who will only have sex with someone who's an environmentalist and who loves animals. Chloe is a conservative, doesn't care about the environment, likes to hunt animals, but she pretends that she has different attitudes in order to get Victoria to sleep with her. Doherty says this is similarly just non-consensual. Victoria wouldn't have consented if she'd known what Chloe's actual attitudes were. Finally, Doherty appeals to the concept of consent. Giving consent, according to Doherty, involves waiving your rights. So to consent that X does P to you is to waive your right that X not do P to you. For instance, to consent that your husband has sex with you is to waive your right that your husband not have sex with you. Now this raises the question of how do we determine which particular rights are waived? I mean, you don't just waive any rights when you give consent. A woman who consents to vaginal sex doesn't thereby consent to anal sex. Doherty accepts a fairly intuitive view here, I think. He says the rights we waive are the rights that we intend to waive. Now, there's no particular person who you're morally obligated to have sex with. You have a right to refuse to have sex with anybody for any reason. Victoria, for instance, has a right to refuse to have sex with people who don't care about the environment and who don't like animals. That might seem silly to us, but that's her right. And just as you can consent to vaginal sex without consenting to anal sex, you can consent to have sex with an environmentalist without consenting to have sex with somebody who isn't an environmentalist. Victoria only waives her right not to have sex with an environmentalist. She doesn't waive her right not to have sex with somebody who isn't an environmentalist. A lot of double negatives in that sentence, so maybe that might not have made any sense, but I think you get the point, right? She's only waiving her right not to have sex with an environmentalist. So Chloe's deception of Victoria, Chloe pretending to be an environmentalist when she isn't, that invalidates Victoria's ability to consent to sex with her. So returning to the cases that we saw earlier, HIV and gender history are likely to be deal breakers for many people. On Doherty's account, it's perfectly reasonable to prosecute people for lying about these things, and that matches up with our current practice. As far as I know, people are prosecuted for lying about HIV and gender history. But birth control is also likely to be a deal breaker. A man is much less likely to consent to have unprotected sex with a woman if he knows she's not on birth control. Women who lie about birth control will have committed rape by deception in many cases on Doherty's view. I mean, again, consenting to have unprotected sex with a woman who's on birth control just isn't the same as consenting to have unprotected sex with a woman who isn't on birth control. And just because you consented to one, you haven't thereby consented to the other. So if a woman lies about that can easily be rape by deception. Lying about love, that will also be a deal breaker for many people. We generally treat lying about love as a minor transgression, but Doherty thinks it should be treated as straightforward rape. I would assume also that cheating, that's another deal breaker. If you go and have sex with somebody else, and that would be a deal breaker. So if you have sex with somebody else and you don't tell your partner, that could simply count as rape on Doxy's view, because your partner wouldn't continue having sex with you if your partner knew that you were cheating on them. So that's rape by deception. So ultimately this means that there's far more rape happening than most of us assume. This certainly challenges our standard attitudes to sex and relationships. And this is one of the account's biggest problems. It seems pretty absurd to say that Chloe is a rapist, or that a man who pretends to love a woman to get her to sleep with him is a rapist, or that a woman who cheats on her husband is a rapist. She's raping her husband by deception. I guess the difficulty we have here is that deception is so widespread and in many ways even unavoidable. There's a tendency to say that deception is sort of just part of the game and we all accept it. People pretend to earn more money than they do. They pretend to be more interesting than they are. They pretend to be to do more exciting things than they really do, and so on. And to some extent, doesn't everybody just put on a mask when they're dating, when they're looking for sex? So I guess Doherty could make a few points here, right? First of all, just because something is common doesn't mean it's acceptable. Slavery was once common. There'd been societies where the majority of the population were slaves and where nobody thought there was anything wrong with that arrangement. Well, it was wrong. It was common, but we've decided now, no, that's not acceptable. So there's no reason why the same shouldn't happen with deception. Second, note that Doherty isn't arguing that deception in general is wrong. He's only arguing that deception about a person's deal breakers is wrong. You can tell all sorts of lies and still be in the clear, because most of the lies that people tell each other don't concern their deal breakers. For most people, it's not a deal breaker if you earn less money than you say. I suppose another worry here with Doherty's argument is that, on the one hand, as we saw in the last video, Doherty wants to reject moralised views of sex. So moralised views of sex are views of sex that treat certain features as important independently of individuals' judgments about them. But it's not really clear that this is actually possible to avoid, because the question is, when is somebody culpable for a deception? If Frank lies about his employment history, he's arguably not culpable if it turns out that that was actually one of Sarah's deal breakers, since we commonly don't really care. We don't expect people to care about employment history. On the other hand, we do expect people to care about gender history. So Frank would be culpable for lying about his gender history, or perhaps even just failing to inform his partner of his gender history. The same is true of HIV. If you have HIV, it's your responsibility to inform your partner. So when we turn to the question of when to hold people culpable for lying or for failing to inform, it looks like we're back at this moralised view of sex, where we're saying that these things are important and these things aren't. It's a big deal if I fail to inform you that I'm married and cheating on my wife. It's not a big deal if I fail to inform you that I'm not a political conservative or whatever. So anyway, that's deception. Some challenging ideas there from Tom Doherty. Moving on, intoxication. There are many ways that people can lose their rational capacities. One of the most common is through intoxication. There's a lot of intoxicated sex going on. The question is, how does intoxication affect consent? If a person voluntarily drinks alcohol to the point that their judgment is impaired, does that person still have the ability to consent? Obviously, we are dealing with cases of people who are drunk or otherwise high, but who are able to walk around, speak relatively plainly, engage in reasoning. It will be shoddier reasoning, but we're thinking about people who are able to think things through to some degree. If somebody's just passed out, or they're so drunk they can't understand what's going on, then obviously they can't consent to anything. So in recent years, the feminists in particular have urged that intoxication pretty much always invalidates consent. If a man has sex with a woman who's drunk, then he's committed date rape. Call this the restrictive view. The restrictive view says that if X is intoxicated, then X is unable to consent to sex. Now, the crucial argument here is that intoxication interferes with a person's ability to make reasoned judgments. Indeed, you know that if a person is intoxicated, they may agree to things they wouldn't agree to if they were sober. So an intoxicated person, in some sense, will act against their own preferences. People who are intoxicated are in a vulnerable position in that sense, and we should protect them. We should use the law to protect them. Another important argument is to consider consent in other cases. If you've become intoxicated, even if you're intoxicated voluntarily, we don't suppose that you can validly consent to getting tattoos or to selling your house or to undergoing surgery and so on. At least that's the case here in the UK. As far as I know, it's illegal for tattoo artists to work on people who are drunk. There are all sorts of contexts where actually we do think that consent is negated by intoxication. So we have an argument sort of like this. If X is intoxicated, then X can't consent to getting tattooed, for instance. If X can't consent to getting tattooed, X can't consent to sex. So intoxication undermines the capacity to consent to sex. Now, I think there are a couple of problems with this argument. First of all, I think it's important to note that these other examples have significant risks, or they have lasting consequences, or a kind of substantial impact on your life. Something like undergoing surgery, that's a very big deal. The same with getting a tattoo. A tattoo permanently alters your skin. On the other hand, I mean, sex, is sex really that much of a big deal? Does it really matter if you have sex and you end up regretting it? Does it really matter? I compare sort of to consent to getting a temporary tattoo or face paint. Both of those involve interfering with your body. They'll even leave a mark for a little while. But drunk people can consent to having those things done. So I guess the general point here is that the riskier something is, or the more permanent it is, the higher the standards we require for consent. Now, I would suggest that consenting to sex is more like consenting to having a temporary tattoo than it is to having a permanent tattoo. So I'm not really inclined to agree with the analogy that's being drawn here. But even, putting that aside, my own inclination in response to this argument is just to bite the bullet. In my view, if you can consent to something while you're sober, you can consent to it while intoxicated. Period. So this argument doesn't work for me. I think drunk people can consent to everything that a sober person can consent to. I really tend to err on the side of personal responsibility when it comes to this kind of thing. You don't have to get drunk. I don't get drunk. In fact, I don't drink at all. I never drink. So it's not required. You choose to get drunk. You accept the risks of getting drunk, and those risks include being more impulsive, being less rational. I just really don't like the sort of coddling, the paternalism, this attitude that we need the government to step in and protect people from their own decisions. I'm not keen on that at all. And so for me, I think that you can consent to getting a tattoo while you're drunk. You can consent to surgery, to selling your house, to whatever. And if you're worried about doing that, then you need to take the precautions to make sure you don't do it before you get drunk. Or you just need to not get so drunk that you might be in that kind of position. I suppose one problem with this attitude is that, what if we're dealing with people who've taken drugs for medical operations? If I've been given a load of morphine for a dental operation, can I consent to selling my house? I don't really want to have to say that. I'm inclined just to draw a distinction between recreational and medicinal uses of drugs, and hold that consent is valid during recreational, but not during medicinal use. So the main argument against the restrictive view is to draw analogies between consent and responsibility. If we accept the claim that intoxication invalidates consent, then we have to say that the conditions for consent and the conditions for responsibility sort of come apart. If a person has voluntarily imbibed alcohol, we hold them responsible for any crimes they commit while drunk. On the other hand, we're saying that they're not able to consent to do things. Prima facie, there seems to be a kind of hypocrisy here. We're saying that a person has the capacities to make autonomous decisions in one respect, but not in another. So we might make the argument along these lines. If X is voluntarily intoxicated, then X is responsible for her actions. In particular, if she's responsible for any crimes she commits, for instance. If X is responsible for her actions while intoxicated, then X has the capacity to consent to sex. So voluntary intoxication does not undermine the capacity to consent to sex. Now, an important objection to this argument is given by Alan Wertheimer, who we saw in the last video. Wertheimer points out that we need not hold that the capacities required for responsibility for wrongdoing are equivalent to the capacities required for consent. Responsibility is a matter of how we should treat the agent based on what she's done. Consent is a matter of what it's permissible to do to the agent. We might say that to be held responsible for your actions simply doesn't require the same degree of understanding or the same ability to reason about consequences as consenting to the actions of others does. Shlomo Wallerstein suggests one way to develop this idea. So Wallerstein says, when people are held criminally responsible for actions while drunk, we appeal to the notion of prior fault. If a person commits a robbery, for instance, the reason why it's no excuse to say, oh, I was drunk so I didn't know what I was doing, is because the robber chose to get drunk knowing it would diminish his capacities for reason, without bothering to take proper precautions. So we can say there was a prior fault, there was a fault before the crime. That's what justifies punishing people for crimes committed while drunk. But prior fault makes no sense with respect to giving consent to sex. The person who consents to sex doesn't do anything that causes harm to another person. There's no fault whatsoever, so there's no prior fault. To put it more clearly, the criminal does something wrong, and since we can't locate the fault in his intentions at the time of the crime because of his diminished capacities, we locate it in his voluntarily getting drunk. That's what allows us to hold him responsible. But the person who consents to sex hasn't done anything wrong, so there's no question of fault. The question of fault just doesn't even arise. I don't really find that argument very persuasive, mainly because I'm not inclined to appeal to prior fault in the case of drunken crimes. I'd say that if you commit a crime when drunk, you're responsible for it at the time that you do it. The fault occurs when you commit the crime. We don't need to appeal to prior fault. I'm not sure what the law says. I'm not a legal scholar, but that's my view at any rate. I don't think there's any need to have this notion of prior fault. I mean, I think there are cases where the notion of prior fault might be important, and these are where the defendant has become intoxicated in such a way that he doesn't know what's going on. So suppose Frank takes some drugs and stabs his friend to death. Frank didn't mean to stab his friend. He was hallucinating because of the drugs. He believed his friend was, an alien monster trying to attack him. And Frank thought he was acting in self-defense. Now, in that case, I think the notion of prior fault would be useful. But notice that that's irrelevant to cases of consent to sex. If Frank has taken drugs and he's hallucinating, and he doesn't realise that he's agreed to have sex and he's having sex, well, that's clearly non-consensual. So we need to look at cases where the criminal and the person who's consented to sex both know what's going on, but their ability to reason is impaired. And I would say that in both such cases, we should just hold people accountable for the decisions that they make at the time. There's no need to bring in this notion of prior fault, in my view. So a different way to develop Wertheimer's idea is to appeal to utilitarian considerations. In this case, our goal is harm reduction. What sorts of policies should we use in order to reduce harms? On this approach, the reason why we hold people responsible for actions they perform while intoxicated is to discourage dangerous actions. If being drunk excused you from responsibility, that would just encourage more crimes and it would give people an easy way out. People are responsible for robbery while drunk because if they weren't responsible for robbery while drunk, anybody could just get drunk, commit a robbery, and then say, well, I was drunk, so they wouldn't be able to prosecute them, which is obviously not the sort of situation we want to encourage. So there's a very good reason, there's a good utilitarian reason, good consequentialist reason for holding people responsible for things they do while drunk. On the other hand, we say that people who are drunk can't consent to sex in order to protect them. Sex can be risky, there are physical harms like STDs, there are mental harms, because people can regret it, and we want to reduce exposure to harms like that. People who are intoxicated are particularly vulnerable because they're less able to reason, they're more impulsive, and so it's worth it's worth saying that they can't consent in order to protect them. So in both cases, what we're doing is trying to reduce harm. We're bringing in, we're treating responsibility and consent differently because that's the best way of reducing harm. So I think there are a couple of problems with this argument. First of all, how harmful is it to have sex when you're drunk? From the point of view of physical harms, it's not much more harmful than sober sex. And as for mental harms, the mental harms associated with drunk sex aren't really a moral problem, in my view. I agree it might be a big deal to some people, but I don't know. I think that that's just not something that the state should be involved in. I guess if some people put a lot of emphasis on sex, and they might really regret it if they've had sex while drunk. But then again, the same thing happens with sober sex. I don't think that it is significantly harmful. And second, we can run the utilitarian argument in the sort of opposite direction, as it were. If we hold that intoxicated consent is valid, if we say people can consent to things when they're intoxicated, well, that would discourage people from getting too drunk. Alcohol use is harmful. If we say that we're not going to protect people from decisions they might regret, well, that could help to discourage people from using too much alcohol. So it seems to me that the utilitarian case could go either way here. So that's not really a totally persuasive argument for me. Okay, a second problem for the restrictive view is, what if two intoxicated people have sex? A man and a woman, both of whom are very drunk, have sex. If we say that people are responsible for crimes committed while drunk, but people can't consent to sex while drunk, then it looks like we have to say that the man and the woman have raped each other. But that just seems absurd, right? So one response to this is to say, is to kind of bite the bullet and say, yes, they have raped each other, but there's no need to prosecute. We don't prosecute every crime. With some crimes, it's decided that it's just not in the public interest to bother prosecuting. In this case, the argument might be that since they've sort of both victimised each other, we should just let it slide. It just kind of doesn't really matter. Of course, for those of us who are a bit more cynical about abuses of police power and overzealous prosecutors and things like that, it's not going to bring much comfort. I can certainly imagine a lot of people ending up getting prosecuted for something like this, even if we sort of say, well, maybe they should let it slide. Once you've made something into a crime, very often the police don't let it slide. So, we need something better than that, I think. A second option is to insist that there's an asymmetry between men and women. If a drunk man has sex with a drunk woman, we can hold the drunk man but not the drunk woman responsible for rape. Basically, we treat it as a standard date rape, in which one person is the rapist and one person is the victim. There are some legal cases in which both people were drunk, but only the man was accused of the rape. I'll link to an article about that in the description box. So that plausibly is a view we might want to take. Of course, that raises the question, how do we justify the asymmetry? So one option is to appeal to evolutionary psychology. I have a video on evolutionary psychology, so go and watch that if you want to know more about it. But evolutionary psychologists tend to hold that there are innate biological differences in the psychologies of men and women, in particular with respect to how men and women negotiate sex. Men and women faced different selective pressures in the past, as a result of which they approach sex in very different ways. And I'm not really sure how this argument would go, but plausibly we might hold that that leads to different moral standards in such a way that we're going to hold men to a higher moral standard than women. The sort of view would be that men, men are the sort of more assertive ones. They are more likely to be the more predatory ones, so that we need to focus more on how to protect women. So that could lead to an asymmetry. A second option is to appeal to feminist arguments. The feminist view is that we live in a patriarchy, a male-dominated society, a society run by men for men. Men have power over women. Women are oppressed in various respects. An important part of the current patriarchy is what's called rape culture. The idea of rape culture is that in our society, rape and other forms of sexual assault are prevalent and normalised. People deny the harms of rape and sexual assault. They blame the victims or stigmatise the victims. Things like, oh, she was asking for it, she was a slut, whatever, things like that. People trivialise rape, they excuse the perpetrators, and so on. Now, generally speaking, men are the perpetrators and women are the victims. I don't actually have any data to hand, but that tends to be a common claim. Although you should check that. Don't take my word for it, because I don't know. I've not actually looked that up. But that's a common claim. Men tend to be the perpetrators of rape. Women tend to be the victims. So what all of this amounts to is that men and women have very different experiences of sex and sexual assault. We might suggest, look, it's just not as big a deal if a woman has sex with an intoxicated man, given the social structure that we have at the moment, where men are the ones with the power. It's just not as big a deal when a woman does it to a man. So that would plausibly justifies an asymmetry. I'm not going to look at either of these approaches in too much detail, but that's one way you might take the argument. I just note a couple of problems with trying to take the argument in this way. First of all, we might worry that this ends up just encouraging sexism. If we're saying that men and women should be treated differently, and that women need special protections from the law, that's dangerously close to the sort of prudish Victorian views of women as weak, as unable to make their own decisions. And secondly, the asymmetry doesn't necessarily solve the whole problem, because it's not just men and women who have intoxicated sex. What about gay sex, where both are drunk? If it's two men having sex and both of them are drunk, what do we say in that case? We can't appeal to asymmetry there, because they're both men. So it's not really clear that this solves the problem. Okay, a third objection to the restrictive view is that it doesn't respect autonomy and personal responsibility. Our ability to control our own lives and make our own choices is very important, and it should be respected, even if these are bad choices. And generally, in life in general, we do respect the bad choices that people make when drunk. We accept that people make bad choices and we hold them accountable for it. One way to think about this is to ask, how would you feel if your partner got drunk at a party and had sex with somebody else? Would you let them off? Would you feel terribly sorry for them because they'd been raped? It would take a saint, I think, to go down that road. And it's also important to bear in mind here that many people choose to become intoxicated in order to lower their inhibitions. People become intoxicated so as to improve their confidence, increase impulsivity, remove their barriers. People go to parties and bars looking for others to have sex with, and even if you're not specifically looking for it, you know perfectly well that if you're drunk it's more likely to happen. Shouldn't we allow people to make these kinds of decisions for themselves? Shouldn't we respect those decisions? So the first response to this is that we can respect autonomy by allowing that people can consent to drunk sex by consenting beforehand. I'm going to get drunk and we can have sex then. Provided you have consent before the person gets drunk, drunk sex is acceptable. This maybe isn't very realistic. I imagine people don't generally conduct themselves by explicitly saying these things, but the point here is that we don't have to rule out all kinds of drunk sex. So refusing to recognise intoxicated consent doesn't necessarily erode people's options. If you're really into drunk sex, you can still do it by consenting to it beforehand. Although there may be some problems here because, in general, consenting to sex at some time doesn't imply that you've consented to it at a later time. People change their minds. So if we're saying that intoxicated consent is invalid, it's not clear that consent prior to being intoxicated would make it acceptable. So second response is, well, we can respect the importance of autonomy and personal responsibility by holding that although it's impermissible for X to have sex with Y if Y is intoxicated, Y is still open to blame. She's still open to blame for her behaviour if she consents. Obviously, it's not real consent, but if she sort of kind of agrees to it, if she acquiesces to it. This is maybe the case of a person who's in a relationship cheating on their partner while they're drunk. I was drunk isn't an excuse. In the same way that you're responsible for crimes committed while drunk, there's still a sense in which you're responsible for having sex while drunk, even if you didn't strictly speaking consent to that sex. Of course, I mean, if we're saying that intoxicated consent is rape, then this just looks like victim blaming, which would presumably not be acceptable. A more important point, I think, about autonomy is made by Alan Wertheimer. Wertheimer notes that there's a tension in the concept of autonomy, since autonomy has positive and negative dimensions. To quote Wertheimer, "We respect an agent's negative autonomy when we say that it is legally or morally impermissible for others to have sexual relations with her without her competent, informed and voluntary consent. We respect an agent's positive autonomy when we make it possible for her to render it permissible for others to engage in sexual relations with her if she consents." Now the problem is that maximising one of these impedes the other. So the argument is that by outlawing intoxicated consent, that actually does respect autonomy. It just respects negative autonomy. Now granted, this reduces positive autonomy somewhat. It means that people who enjoy intoxicated sex and people who want to get intoxicated and have sex, those people will have their options curtailed. But protecting people, reducing rape and reducing sexual assault, that's more important than allowing a bit of fun every now and then. But in any case, the point here is that you can't claim that the restrictive view erodes autonomy. It just emphasises a different kind of autonomy than the more liberal view. Okay, so we've examined some of the things that we might take to undermine consent: coercion, deception, intoxication. Personally, I tend to be pretty liberal when it comes to intoxication. I think people should just be. I think people can consent while intoxicated. Deception, I'm not sure. Coercion, I'm not sure there either. So it's a difficult one. One thing I do hope to have shown is that consent is actually quite a tricky subject. You sometimes hear these slogans about how it's consent is easy, consent is simple. But I think when we really start to examine it, it's not easy at all. As with everything else in life, there are all kinds of grey areas and difficult cases. Just to conclude, I'd suggest that a major source of the debates here is in our prima facie attitudes to sex. Is sex generally risky, harmful, bad, and so on? How bad is it to have bad sex? I think that I tend to think that even relatively unpleasant sexual experiences aren't really that bad. If there's a sort of nominal consent present, as long as it's not sort of straightforward rape. So we don't need to have high standards for consent. It's important to have high standards of consent to surgery or to tattoos because these permanently alter a person's body. But sex is just sex. But there are plenty of people who have far more pessimistic attitudes towards sexuality. So they're more likely to demand strict standards for consent. So I think that part of this is going to be on our, as I say, our prima facie attitudes towards it. How bad a bad sexual experience is. Okay, in the next video we're going to change tack a little bit and examine the ontology of consent. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.